It's said that heaven speaks to humankind through visions, dreams, and sacred texts, guiding people towards the good. Even as our world modernizes, could it be that heaven still speaks to us today? And if so, are we still listening? Lee Whitting, retired chaplain and podcast host, is dedicated to delivering what he considers God's word, but not necessarily from the Bible. What he puts out comes from the resuscitated. I'm Sue Biamba, and this is Mysteries of Life.
When I turned to run, the first bullet hit my left leg and two more bullets followed.
I ended up in pitch darkness.
I experienced myself leaving my body.
I turned around to see what that warmth was, and I saw this gentleman all dressed in white suit coat on, white stole or robe over his shoulders, and long white beard, long white hair, but very, very pink skin.
Just out of nowhere, but yet everywhere all at once, a voice came and it said, "Return. It's not your time."
These are the voices of people who venture to what some call the other side.
Welcome to NDE Radio with Lee Whitting, whether you're listening.
And Lee's podcast is their medium.
I've interviewed now over the 10 years I've been doing it upwards of 500 other NDEers.
NDEers, as in near-death experiencers, people who've had a profound spiritual experience in the face of impending death. Some of them say they were given a message in heaven.
Now, you heard the voices, and I'm going to say they're angels, saying that humans have to ask for their help. That they weren't asking for help themselves. They were giving you a message to give to us, basically.
Right. Yes. And then my angel, my granddad, told me that my message was to not fear death.
What inspired you to start sharing ND stories with others?
Well, I guess the initial start was when at 7 I drowned and had my own near-death experience. I wandered too far into a lake. I did not know how to swim, and when the bottom of the lake dropped off, I went down. I came up once. I called for my mother, screamed for my mother, who had gone into the cottage nearby. And of course, by screaming, all the air went out of my lungs and I sank. My body sank to the bottom of the lake. But as my body was down at the bottom of the lake, my soul was suddenly up in a birch tree next to the cottage, and I was watching my mother run down to the shore because fortunately she'd heard my scream, knew about where I was, dove into the lake, found me, dragged me out, and threw me face down over a log and pumped on my back trying to get the water out of my lungs. And she said it was later she said it was that was all she knew how to do. But of course the log underneath me was doing chest compressions, so it was really like she'd invented CPR without knowing it. And that brought me back to my body. But I had dreams, recurrent dreams after that for years about what I thought was sinking down slowly into the lake, surrounded by darkness with a pinpoint of light. And I thought that must be the sun shining on the surface of the lake. So in my 20s, I went back to that same lake on the same kind of day, dove down to about where I was when I drowned. And I looked up, and it didn't look at all like my dreams. But it wasn't until years later that after Raymond Moody wrote Life After Life, and I started studying this a little more, I realized that I had probably been going toward the light when I decided to stay and, in my body, or go back to my body. And so that image of sinking away from the light and into a dark place was probably just my dream's way of interpreting my return from the other side. And it had an immediate effect on my life because I'd been a normal kid, watched Howdy Doody and Hopalong Cassidy and all those early TV shows on our little black and white TV. Suddenly I was very interested in astronomy, and I started reading about it. I persuaded my parents to buy me a reflecting telescope, and I'd be out at night. On a clear night, I'd be in the backyard looking at the moon and the planets and the Pleiades and all of the things that I found so fascinating. I just wanted to know more about the big picture.
Lee would go on to become a non-denominational chaplain, working at Eastern Maine Medical Center in Maine. But that wasn't the end of his fascination with NDEs.
I've made a point of looking up people who had died, had coded, we say, and then had been resuscitated. And about 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 12 would have a story, would have a memory of something they had seen on the other side. And so that every time I ran into something like that, I was even more intrigued. And finally, I went back to my seminary where I'd gotten my MDiv and got a doctorate in NDE studies, as chaplains can use them in hospital.
Lee says he would speak to about 30 people a day, meeting people and sharing near-death experiences in the ICU, emergency room, and other departments. He says he had met thousands of patients by the end of his service at the hospital.
I was a non-denominational chaplain, and there's a certain quality of non-denominationalism in near-death experience. They're universal. They happen to anyone and everyone. And they are always personalized and to a great extent, but they are also fundamentally the same. So it doesn't really matter how you were raised, whether you're a believing Christian or an atheist or come from a different religious tradition. The voice from the light has actually told a number of people who've had near-death experiences that it's not your religion, it's your capacity for love that is determinative of how you spend eternity. I would meet all kinds of people. Mostly I found, as time went on, fewer and fewer of them belonged to organized religions. I'd look in the door, I'd say, "Hi, I'm the chaplain, would you like a visit?" Most everyone would say yes, but then they'd add, "I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual," or I don't belong to any particular denomination. Or they would say something like, "I'm Wiccan," or, a witch, or once in a while I get some crazy kid who would want to claim he was a vampire or wanted to be a vampire. I talked to everyone because it was all so very interesting, and I never tried to impose my point of view on any of it, because I thought just by talking about what they were interested in, I could demonstrate the importance of compassion, empathy, and love.
Can you describe some of the most memorable ones that you heard?
I'll give you one simple example from a hospital visit I made. I went in and asked the woman if she'd seen anything when she was on the other side. She said, yes. She said, "I saw my dad, and he died 3 years before." And this is a woman in her 60s probably. She said, "I was so glad to see him, and he looked so good. He looked young. He looked the way I remembered him when he was much younger, in his 30s, I guess. And behind him," she said, "I saw this beautiful light, and I just wanted to run into it." And he said, "No, you've got to go back. It's not your time." And she said, so suddenly I was like a little girl trying to run past my dad. And she tried to dart past him, and he just picked her up and held her and said, "No, you've got to go back." And then she came back. But she was so happy to have had that experience. And as a chaplain, you can take a story like that, go to the next room. There might be a cancer patient, somebody that a doctor has told, "Oh, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do for you." Someone in terrible depression and in pain. And if chaplains would only realize they can use these stories to pick up people's spirits. So I would say to a person like that, "Well, listen, I just heard a really interesting story from another patient. Would you like to hear about it, about how she died and what she saw?" And I'd tell them this story that I just told you. And they were their spirits were so lifted by that, because one thing it does is it removes your fear of death. The second thing it does is it tells you there's a God that loves us, that there's consciousness on the other side, and that consciousness is a wave that we can relate to. I mean, that our spirit can bond with, and that we're so welcome there.
But as welcoming as these messages can be, there's a number of people who dismiss them, reject them, and even demonize near-death experiencers or their accounts. That's according to a study by NDE researcher Janice Holden, who looked at how different groups reacted to hearing someone's NDE. Out of 188 incidences, most NDEs were received positively by medical, mental health, and religious groups, which means they acknowledged that the experience may have been real. The study, however, also found that every group had incidences that scored negatively, some even demonized for sharing. Lee says he's come across some bad cases.
The worst ones, being a hospital chaplain, are the doctors who absolutely refuse to hear anything like that. And patients want to tell them, they come back, they get resuscitated, and they're back, and they say, "Doctor, I met Jesus," or, "I saw my grandfather," and they freak. Some of them would just turn around and say, "No, it was the drugs. You were hallucinating," and walk out of the room. And it was my job to tell them, "Don't do that." You'd never tell a Catholic person to throw that rosary away because that was silly, would you? And they'd say, "Well, no, of course not." Well, this was the most important spiritual experience of that person's life. This was a life-changing incident in their lives, and you should not belittle it or demean it or criticize it in any way. For God's sake, just stop and listen to the story. Maybe it'll do you some good. And I would do this to the doctors. And finally, I got some of them to come around. We even gave classes in near-death experience at the hospital. And when we would say, "Okay, there's going to be a lunchtime meeting on this," it was always jam-packed because people, even though they were denying it, wanted to know more about it.
This issue also exists outside the medical community. NDEs deal with topics that many spiritual and religious adherents can relate to, such as heaven, angels, and gods. They can also deal with subjects that some may find unconventional, like reincarnation, which leads to some pushback. Such is the case of author Jacob Dean. Jacob says he had a near-death experience while he was a child and saw more than one life. Open to Dean's story, Lee interviewed him in 2021.
I was able to see the planet from a micro and macro perspective, in a sense that I was able to see a lot of events that I would live, in my lifetime, and that went past this lifetime and even past lifetimes.
In Lee's view, God is still speaking to people, and near-death experiences are one of his means. So to deny the reality of NDEs isn't a small thing.
All our shows, 500 plus shows, are available on YouTube. And so we get comments on each show. And sometimes there'll be people who say, "Oh, this is ridiculous," or "Jesus only loves Christians," or, something along those lines. And I try and write them back, if I can, to give them a broader picture, not to put them down, but just to let them know that there's a bigger way of seeing this thing that's not at all incompatible with Christianity. In fact, it's more compatible with Christianity than most churches would have it, because denominations tend to be very exclusive and self-limiting. They want their parishioners to toe the line according to their point of view. And there are just too many points of view that are compatible with God that religions can be a real problem in terms of denial. I had an experience with a church in Sedona, Arizona. I saw that the pastor was going to preach on near-death experience one Easter Sunday, which is appropriate because that's Jesus' resurrection. And I thought, well, that's unique. This is pretty fundamentalist church. I went to the service because I happened to be in Arizona, and turned out the minister had a friend who'd had a near-death experience, and all of a sudden he's thinking, maybe there is something to this. Well, he starts in on this thing, and his parishioners are standing up in the congregation saying, "I had a story to tell you like that." It was such an interactive event. Normally a pastor will give a sermon and everyone sits there with their hands folded and listens. People were so excited to hear this story or to hear this particular sermon. He went on for the next 5 Sundays, apparently, preaching about all his sermons were based on near-death experiences. He even got some video clips of people relating their own stories, which are available on YouTube and other places. And so if the churches would come around to see the value of this thing and that they wouldn't feel threatened by it, that would be another huge step forward. Right now, church attendance is down below 50% in this country. It's now down around 39% according to a recent survey. That's killing churches. Mainline churches are really struggling now. If they would acknowledge that God is still speaking, it's not just the Bible and only the Bible. I mean, how did the people that wrote the Bible down, how did they get that message? Some of them got it through dreams. Some of it got it through automatic writing. Some of it got these amazing books in the Bible through near-death experiences. And to deny the reality that God is still speaking to us is to shortchange God, I think.
Could it be that the divine speaks to people through near-death experiences? Looking at Christianity, Paul the Apostle, speaking of himself in third person, gives an account of what some may describe as an NDE. He says the following in 2 Corinthians chapter 12.
I will move on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who was caught up into the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether he was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. I know that this man, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise. He heard inexpressible words, which a man is not allowed to speak.
Some suggest that Paul could be referring to when he was stoned in Lystra, dragged out of the city, and thought to have died. But whether this was an NDE is open for interpretation. In any case, we can gather that Paul at least received a message in heaven during what may have been an out-of-body experience. Some say that God no longer reveals anything new to people outside of the Bible. Others, that whatever is experienced must conform to it. As they say, everything one should know is in it. This can lead to disputes over whether what NDers experience is true and good. But a number of Christian NDers, like Lee Whitting and others, have come to understandings that go beyond what is written or spelled out in the scriptures, without losing their faith. Some have come to believe in the existence of multiple gods and the soul's delivered choice to be human and in reincarnation. Lee himself is part of that 30% of Christians who believe in reincarnation. Let's now zoom out and look at the topic more broadly. A study was conducted by near-death researcher Dr. Jeffrey Long on God's presence in NDEs and published his findings in his book, God and the Afterlife. According to his book, about 46% of 420 responses said they were aware of God or a supreme being's existence during the experience. About 40% said no. Near-death experiencers were also asked if they had a sense of knowing special knowledge or purpose during the experience. About 46% said yes, 41% no. In his book, Dr. Long includes the account of a woman named Cynthia, who nearly died of a tumor in her pineal gland when she was 12 years old. Cynthia said she had met God.
I asked him whether only people of one religion will make it into heaven. He said, everyone who believes and has faith, even those who don't think they do, will make it. It depends on what's in their hearts.
Dr. Long says that God is rarely portrayed as giving specific instructions to NDers about what to believe in the world. There are some who say that what is seen in near-death experiences could be evil. Lee's response is that an evil force couldn't send out a message of love, which is a common theme in many of them. He even says that he believes that they have a divine purpose. More on that when we return. Lee would eventually work with the International Association for Near-Death Studies as the editor of their magazine called Vital Signs, then joining the board of directors.
As I was leaving the board, I said, what we ought to do is we ought to broadcast some of these stories, these near-death experience stories. I mean, people ought to hear them. They're not just going to come to IANS and ask for a written version of a near-death experience. So they looked at me and they said, well, great, you do it. So that's how I started. But once I got into it, I realized how meaningful it was to me as well as to, the listeners. I do believe that there is a divine purpose. I think that people are called. Why, when I said there were 1 out of 12 who had a memory of a near-death experience, what about the other 11? What happened to them? I mean, I get that question all the time. It's because their soul wasn't called out of their body. They were lying there. They were going to be resuscitated, and they don't see anything or remember anything because they never left their body. The souls that are called out for a reason. They are called to learn something about themselves or to come back with a message. I mean, someone I interviewed the other day, his whole near-death experience was a message, and the message was, you're not living up to your potential to, let people know. And the message and the experience were one and the same. In other words, the message was, get down there and tell them what you're going through here right now, because you haven't been doing it, even though when you left here, that was your intention, was to tell them more about the love and the peace and the comprehensive nature of the other side. The oneness is the best word for it, I guess. We arrive with an awareness. We arrive with an intention. We arrive with an assignment. More often than not, I think we miss the boat.
On YouTube, Lee's channel has over 2 million views on his ad-free interviews. So far, some 500 stories of people who say they experienced the other side. Lee says that hosting this program is a part of his divine assignment.
Well, I feel like I'm on it by doing the show, my chaplain work. As I said, I had lots of jobs. I was the editor and publisher of a weekly newspaper, and I did lots of different things in order to support the family and make a living. When I became a chaplain, I felt like I was home. And it was being armed with a near-death experience of my own and others that really fulfilled that purpose. And far more, when I also pastored a church. I hardly ever did sermons in my church. What we would do when it came time for a sermon, we were all sitting down together. We didn't have a pulpit as such. We would do joys and concerns. Everyone would talk about their own life and what was going on in their life. And it became like a group therapy session. And I thought that was far more valuable than my telling them how they should live their lives. It was better that we all heard how they were living their lives and give support to that. What I would like to see is an acknowledgement that near-death experience is real, because it has huge consequences for the attitude of the civilization. I mean, I think if people realized that our life on Earth is short and when we step over into the oneness of eternity, which is really timelessness, it's not eternity, it's not endless time, it's no time. But if they could put that into somewhere in the back of their heads, I think it would mean a big change in how much time we devote to politics and money making, kill or be killed, corporate structures, all of the things that are really tearing our civilization apart right now. I mean, we're at each other's throats over stupid things, and we're cruel to one another for stupid reasons, and there's no justification for it. And if people had the perspective that near-death experience could provide, and they should be getting it through their churches, but they're not. They should be getting it through their science, but science hasn't tied quantum to NDEs yet. If we could teach the reality of it even in schools and college, I learned when I was at Columbia University, I studied Eastern religions. Powerful messages, and this was not being taught as a religion per se, it was being taught as a philosophy, like Buddhism, for instance. I would come out of class and probably could have lost my life in traffic because I was so blown away by the ideas contained in that class lecture that's all I could think about. I had to wander 10 blocks down to my apartment in New York, crossing traffic, and not thinking at all about where I was right then, because I was thinking so much about near-death experience can have that same impact. on people if they devoted their time and energy to just once in a while thinking about these things and what it means in their life. It could make a big difference in the world.
It's been great having you with us, and we hope to see you next time on Mysteries of Life.